Tell us first, Revolution Song. What is the song of the title?
Yeah, I'd say in the beginning of the book that this idea I had, it didn't, I didn't have I guess normally a title comes from your theme, and I didn't think I had a theme. I thought it was just about people's lives. And these 6 different, I had this notion, this metaphor, this musical metaphor, that it was these people all kind of singing different parts of the same song. So I reached to music for my thematic glue.
And in the end, does it feel like a song? Does it feel like they really come together in one big story? Or after delving deeply into their lives, are they still very separate individuals?
I don't think I'm the best person to answer that. I mean,
the reader.
I think the readers have to answer that. But I did the whole time I was doing it. I think it's important with every book that you kind of go out on a different limb, that you risk something, and I was risking something. Normally, the way I would write a book is I'm mixing history and historiography. So you're in there with the people in their lives and telling that story, and then I'll pull back to today, or I'll pull back and say, well, in 1950 we discovered this letter that changed our understanding of that event. So I'm moving back and forth. And with this book, I wanted to kind of create a little bit of an alternate story of America's founding. So I wanted it to just be a story. So it's just a story. I mean, it's just in there with the people and weaving their lives together. But I was also conscious of the fact that, well, these are so disparate, these lives, that for some people maybe it's too, maybe the way I wrote it, it doesn't kind of pull it together enough. So readers will tell us.
I was fascinated by the portrait of George Washington, who comes back, of course, through the entire book. You really take him down a peg, or maybe even 2. Terrible general, difficult man, vain, and the one I really thought was hilarious, a shopaholic. But he's still on the cover. The painting on the cover is Emanuel Leutz's 1851 Washington crossing the Delaware, which of course is a sort of, for the kind of book you've written, it's almost an old-fashioned kind of heroic image. So what's the tension between these two?
Well, it was actually my idea to use the painting. And we were looking...
That's not the picture of Washington that you paint in the book.
Right, okay, fair enough. The publisher and I, we were all searching for images from the period that showed a group of people struggling together, because that's kind of what the book represents. And then I hit on that picture, which is this, to Americans, this very famous image. But what I liked about it was the way it was laid out. Washington is at the front of the ship. So if you did it and you turned it around, flipped it around, you have this group of people struggling on the front of the book. And then you see, oh yeah, Washington's one of them when you turn it over. So that was my way of kind of making it work to the story I was telling.
In 1782, there was a call for George Washington for king. King.
Yeah, well, that was what people assumed. I mean, a monarchy that was the template. That's what a government was.
It's just the fallback option.
That was what it was assumed, and a lot of his fellow leaders assumed, and they had exchanged letters about, will it be Washington? Will he, become a monarch? I mean, the states had developed their constitutions essentially while the war was going on. So, I mean, there were these notions of representative government, but the simplest thing would have been, and a lot of people, probably most people would have said, you know what, the simplest thing, you go ahead and be a monarch. So it was, of course, a big deal when he said, no, this is, the kinds of work that we've been doing in Virginia, that you all have been doing in New York, toward these representative governments, that's what we have to do.
So in spite of perhaps not being that great a military man, he did have this fundamental understanding of how the United States were different from Britain.
Yes, he did. He was not a great military man. He was not, he was self-educated. He was self-taught as a military man. He just started at age 22 in the Virginia militia because the British wouldn't allow him to be an officer because he was an American, he was a colonial. And had they allowed him to, who knows how things
The story would have been very different.
But as a member of this Virginia militia, which you got marched around and things, but there was no real training. And then when he assumed real command, he found a book and read how you array troops in battle and things like that. So each stage of his life, he kind of learns it on his own. But he corresponded with the leaders in Virginia and the other states about these notions of what they were doing about a representative democracy and forming these kinds of forming councils, forming state governments, and having ultimately a governor who was not appointed by the King of England. So yeah, he took those things to heart, as did the others.
I was fascinated by the figure of Abraham Yates, because he really represents what you said in your introduction about the revolution being, to a very large extent, a class struggle. He was afraid that by becoming a republic, a federal construct, that that would be a kind of conspiracy against the common man and his right to determine his own life. Would Yates have been a Trump voter?
I think what you saw recently in this last election, the Trump voters were people who would have sided with Yates, but since then it has switched to the other side, and they're the people now who are afraid of the federal government and what it might do, and basically most other people in the world.
What was it that drove Yates to be so convinced of the one model versus the other? He started out as a shoemaker, a self-educated man, but he became a real devotee of the cause of fighting federalism down to his deathbed.
Yeah, I think
what drove him?
I think, well, he was an enormous reader, a reader of history, and he created this wild, which is unpublished, history of the state of New York, which goes back to like the ancient Egypt. And he spends a lot of time on the Greeks and their city-states and how that is the proper, that's as big as a democracy ought to be. And then he spends an enormous amount of time in the Dutch Republic in the 17th century. And then he gets a little bit of time in, oh yeah, here we are in America fighting this. Because he's very proud of his Dutch background. So I think it has to do with that. These people thought democracy is a local thing. We all gather in a room and we solve our problems. And the minute we, which history has shown that whenever the power base is hundreds or thousands of miles away, there's trouble for us.
But this tradition is still very strong in American politics and in community life. The town hall meeting, the caucus, these are all really expressions of the kind of self-governing unit that Yates would have been in favor of. They're still very strong in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, they exist, but, they're, the anger has to do with the fact that people far away are taking our money, our tax money, and they're using it to support things that are against my values, abortion or whatever, however they spin it or however they see it. They think that a distant power is ruling them. And, that also might be just one justification for other beliefs, for other ways of looking at things, because the way it is being understood lately is it has to do as much as anything else with kind of tribalism. People like me, people who are the same color as me, the same background, who, whether it had the same work life or education experience, that's who I support. And that, these other things are kind of a politically correct way of looking at the same issues.
When you left the Netherlands to go back and live in the U.S., that's now 4 years ago, you had already gotten the idea to work on this book. But what I never thought to ask you, and I can ask you now, is why the American Revolution now? What is it that's so topical about the American Revolution in our times, and this was before Trump entered the White House, that made you want to write this book?
Right. I write history, and I thought I was really writing history, and then in the last year of working on it, I was like, oh my God, these documents that I've been knee-deep in suddenly are terribly relevant. I think I was interested in trying to understand what it felt like to be willing to fight, to really fight for freedom of the press, freedom of speech, things like that. And now, lo and behold, it's we're kind of in that position, is how I feel lately. But I wouldn't say it was an academic thing in my mind, but it was history. I thought I was doing history. I didn't think it would feel so relevant to me.
Having discovered that I had learned so much from this book, which was rather embarrassing and rather confronting, as I said in my introduction. I was really wondering, what did you learn from this? So help me out here.
Yeah, well, I learned little things like the fact that George Washington and his wife, Martha, used the aphrodisiac Spanish fly. And I don't know if they did it because they were just so enamored with each other or because they had problems. But then I learned larger things like, I was, it kind of only hit me in the middle of it somewhere that these people were deciding to fight, to as you said, to change their way of thinking as British subjects and say we're now going to fight this very nation that we've grown up feeling ourselves a part of. So that's one step, but then they agree to fight in these vicious battles and have no idea what will result. Okay, so we'll form some new entity, but what will it be? And maybe it would have been a monarchy. And so the idea of like flinging yourself into the unknown, and people stretched all up and down the East Coast who didn't know, also like the Dutch Republic in the 17th century, people didn't think of themselves as Americans. They thought of themselves as Virginians or New Yorkers or Pennsylvanians. So you had to like do this exercise of imagination to say we're all together and we don't know where we're going, but we think it'll be better, which is amazing.
And is this concept of we don't know where we're going, we're all in it together in this huge undefined place, then, is that still a flaw of American solidarity? Have we ever gotten over that?
You mean, is it bad to think we're all in this together?
Maybe it's just too big a place to govern.
Well, that gets to the question of where is all of this stuff that we're in now going to go? And, because in the old days you could fight a civil war and here would be these states would fight these states and, it would be bloody and then it would be over. And but it's I think, maybe it's too big, but it's also, there are these forces of cohesion that are there. There's the state, there's this amorphous idea. No, I'm an American. No, I'm an American. How it will, I've been talking to people lately who've been, and asking them about, like, where do you think this is going? And it's interesting, people saying the federal system is going to dramatically change so that one way or another, in all likelihood, the federal government will shrink in power. Trump is like denuding the State Department, the Environmental Protection Agency, just not hundreds and hundreds of people who presumably had jobs that were important aren't there anymore. And whatever happens in the elections this year and 2 years later, the office of the presidency will probably be diminished for perhaps good reasons. And the states will grow in power. So then it's back to the Yates model a little bit. If the states have, right now, California and New York, they're leading this charge of combating the federal government in court. So if you have a system where the federal government is shrinking and the states are growing in power, but then you have this whole other element, which is large corporations, and especially corporations like Google and Facebook and these companies that are kind of nothing, but they're in everybody's pocket right now. I mean, and they have much more power in the states. They can leverage, they can go to states and say, what's what Amazon's doing right now, it's taking different states and kind of bidding them against one another, and they're all kind of falling over each other to be the headquarters of the next Amazon plant. So, that's a very, how that map evolves, it's going to be something completely new, I think.
So perhaps even going back in history to a model that we've known before.
Yeah, and once again, if I go back to the Dutch in the 17th century, you had this loose confederation, you had strong provinces, and then you had, like the VOC, you had these corporations that were, in a way, more powerful than this federal state. So maybe that's a model.
The Amazon or the Facebook of the 17th century. Another eye-opener. Harvard and Stanford just published a bit of research last week showing that how long-lasting the influence is of having been a slave-holding region or a slave-holding state, that those states are still almost one-on-one still voting Republican. And I wondered if you felt that the decision, even by prominent Americans such as George Washington not to give slaves independence and voting rights continues as a fundamental flaw in our society.
Yes. I think that is one of the, I don't think it's as simple as that. I think that's one overlay. Another is this regional versus national, and another is a class system, and the idea that we're regular people and they're the overlords who are trying to, tell us what to do and how to think. And so I think those are different ways of looking at the same issue, which is one reason it's so hard to identify and come to grips with, because it shifts. But I think they all relate, and I think slavery is really, really central to the struggle that America's in now.
While you were researching the life of Venture Smith, you found out that members of his family were planning a trip to Ghana to honor their ancestor, and you went with them. Can you tell us about the trip?
Yeah, so Venture Smith was such a remarkable figure that people in his time, after he died, people in the town, in the community, passed down stories about him. In the 19th century, they published a little booklet of stories about Venture. And in his family...
That's in addition to his own book.
Right, in addition to his own book. And in his own family, his children and his grandchildren, they all passed down stories of him. So again, this is not a typical, quote, slave. This is an extraordinary person. And that happened right to the present. And I was planning a trip to Ghana to go to Anamabo, to the slave castle, so-called, where he was processed into slavery. And I found out that this group of his descendants were planning this a pilgrimage. And so I managed...
Have you had any contact with them yet?
Had I? No, I can't. I don't think I had contact with them. I mean, once I found out, then I had contact with them.
You found out before you had already actually met them.
Right.
Oh.
And then, so we met up there, and we visited these sites together, and we met with historians in Ghana, and we went to the slave castle, which, if you've ever been to these things in West Africa, the remarkable places, and you see the manacles on the wall and the rusted cannons with the George III insignia on them, and it was amazing. And most of them had never. That was the first time they got a passport, first time they'd ever left the country, and they all lived still in New England. So again, when you're doing history, you feel from time to time. Sometimes you feel this is so ancient, this way of thinking, this way of looking, and other times you feel it's so close to who we are, to where we are now. And so these people, there were several generations, and the ones who were kind of my age, their father had grown up with the stories of Venture and passed them along to him, and he had always wanted to go to make this trip, and never did. So they brought with them an Advil bottle, which contained some of their father's ashes and some of the soil from Venture Smith's grave. And they sprinkled it on the beach, along where the fort is. So it was a remarkable experience and a way to kind of make history come alive for you while you're working on the thing.
What a wonderful homage to this very special man. Yeah. Given the name giver of our institute, I couldn't help but be on the lookout for mentions of John Adams in this book. And one of the mentions that, really only towards the end of the book, but I was very curious, you say that John Adams was toxically jealous of Washington. Yeah. Why?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Washington was, he kind of...
Washington having been the first president, John Adams the second.
Washington was the first president, and for 2 terms, and he in a way, he got sort of a free pass. He was the most famous man in the country. He was the general who led the army, and it was the by universal decree of the other leaders, he should become the first president. So the first president was not elected by the people, it was chosen by them. And he was a special person to everyone of the period. He was like the only choice. So he had 2 terms, and they were very rocky, but he was given kind of special treatment, except near the end when things got ugly. Then Washington, his vice president, becomes the second president. He lasted 1 term, and it was kind of like everybody took off the gloves, and his tenure was very tempestuous. And for a short time, he thought about bringing Washington in to assist him.
And then he died.
And well, yeah, but I mean, then he got over that. He got over that issue. Adams did, and I think he got over it partly because of this jealousy, because he was afraid then that Washington would overshadow.
Book about John Adams, a sequel to David McCullough's biography.
Yeah, David McCullough. I think
Does he have the last word?
As far as I'm concerned.
Okay. One and a half last question, Russell. There's an interview with you on our site by Catherine October Matthews, and in it you referred to legislation on freedom of the press, which went back even far before the revolution, another eye-opener. And that makes you relate that to current times, and that it's shocking to believe that something like that, which is so anchored in the American psyche and the Constitution and all the rest of it, could now be imperiled. And you say we're living in historically dangerous times. Did this book, which you started before the current presidency, did that reinforce your conviction that we're living in historically dangerous times?
Yeah, but I would say that people can access these documents. You can read the debates, you can read the Federalist Papers, you can read books like mine, or you can go see Hamilton, I mean, there are a lot of ways to begin to access the period, and doing that really does make the past come right up into the present. I mean, American history is not, it's a short enterprise, and it would be nice if it continued a while longer. Thank you, Tracy.